Okay, don't see really anyone else outside who's milling in. So let's get started. It's a pleasure to have Priyanga here with us. I will spare you the details, but Priyanga has done some, amazing work on a lot of different aspects of theoretical ecology, in particular temperature and its effects on ecosystems. We'll hear a lot of her stuff today. And again, Priyanga is an extremely decorated professor, et cetera, et cetera. You can sort of look it up. I won't embarrass her with it here, but I think it'll be a joy to hear what she has to share with us over her next 3 lectures, I believe. Is that right? And there's also tutorials that are going to be associated with it. And the tutorials are going to be taken by Prajwal, who's sitting over there. These are going to be a little bit different, I think, from the other tutorials that you've done, in that you'll also get to play around with a few problems that you'll solve, maybe somewhat in the spirit of what Danny was doing in his last lecture. So please engage with these and have fun.
Thank you, Akshit. So I am really happy to be here, and I'm even happier than I was last week, because yesterday morning I got to spend a whole hour observing a tiger, getting rather up close and personal. So I feel like I've lived the high life and could die in peace now. So on that note, we can get started with my lectures. So I try to train students to do good science. And in my universe, good science means good biology and good mathematics. And what that means is good biology means is not only just asking a good question, but to have the insight to really get at that question, get inside the question, so you know how to look for the answers. And good mathematics to me is to develop theory that's strongly rooted in the biology. If your model is not rooted in the biology, then you're doing neither good biology nor good mathematics. So I try to train my own students, my postdocs, to apply this, adopt this philosophy, and to be always mindful that when you do theory, if you're interested in biology and you're doing theory in biology, you should really get inside your biological problem. Okay, so now in that spirit, what I do, my philosophy is to elucidate mechanisms from Persp principles and generate predictions that can then be tested with the data. So that predictions are independent of the data, right? So that means that they can also have some generality and can apply beyond a specific system. And this is what we are going to try to learn in my lectures today's. And then, let me see. All right, so I focus on this, these 2 aspects, the interplay between nonlinearity and variability, because that is what ultimately generates diversity. Now, nonlinearity arises when biotic factors generate density or frequency dependence in fitness. Variability arises when abiotic factors alter these nonlinearities, generating spatial or temporal variation in the density dependent, frequency dependent processes, meaning spatial or temporal variation in fitness. Now, the patterns we see in the world are ultimately the result of this interplay between nonlinearity and variability. So in our quest, if that is our quest to understand the patterns that we see that we are puzzled by, then we have to understand, first of all, what these 2 things are, and then second, what their interplay generates, okay? All right, so our goal is to develop mathematical models to understand the mechanistic underpinnings of this interplay between nonlinearity and variability. So that's the ultimate goal. And having that sort of mechanistic understanding means that you can both explain the patterns that you see, things that puzzle you. Why are things like that? Why does body size increase with latitude? Why are there so many species in the tropics? But also to predict how those patterns might change when there are perturbations, disturbances to the biotic and abiotic environment. And that kind of mechanistic theory also provides the conceptual underpinnings for important environmental problems such as conservation, invasive species, and climate warming. Okay, all right, so there are two aspects to the problem that I'm going to go through in my 3 lectures. The very first thing is the nature of these. I shall obviously explain what non-linearity means. In the absence of any variability in the biotic or abiotic environment, what does non-linearity alone do? Right? Anytime you have more than one factor, you want to understand each factor before you look at the interaction. And the second one is to get at this interplay between non-linearity and variability. And we are going to look at the spatial dimension in my next lecture and temporal dimension in my last lecture. Now, so we want to start, and today we want to start with this question. Now, nonlinear dynamics, meaning nonlinear interactions between species in the absence of any environmental variation. And we want to do that because without nonlinearity, you don't really get the dynamics and diversity we observe. So in other words, it's the fundamental driver of dynamics and diversity. All right. So what is nonlinearity? So I want to make sure we are all on the same page because I'll be saying these things a lot. So nonlinearity means any negative or positive feedback process that generates frequency or density dependence. Now, we are going to focus more on density dependence because it's much more commonly encountered in ecology. Now, density dependence can be negative or positive. This is a feedback process. I mean, you've seen this. What is a thermostat? A negative feedback, right? Right, when it's hot. Okay, so let's get into, so we want to get into really understanding what this means. What even does density dependence mean, right? So negative density dependence is really crucial because it's the process that underlies population regulation and species coexistence. It allows species to increase when they're rare from small numbers and to decrease when they're abundant. So there's some sort of regulation. And that ability then leads to what we call attractors, which are stable equilibria, meaning if the system is perturbed from that equilibrium, it tends to come back at least from a local domain of attraction. Okay, right. And do not worry if you don't understand any of it now. I'm sure you have, how you do, because you've gone through a lot of lectures, but I explain everything I say. So we will get to the definition. All right, so the formal definition of density dependence. The formal definition is that the per capita growth rate is an increasing or decreasing function of density. So if the population growth rate is given by the number times its function, which is of itself, f is a function of n. So that's a function that is represents the per capita growth rate of that population. So that's just general notation, right? So then to really understand this, we want to start with density independent population growth, which we all know. There's the exponential growth model. Here's the per capita growth rate. Is this per capita growth rate dependent on density? No. So as we know, it's independent. And then we look at the logistic model, we see, indeed, we know this, right? We know this, that per capita growth rate is a decreasing function of density, and that's negative density dependence. Now, when you say negative density dependence, that's just a term. What does it mean biologically? It means there's self-limitation in species. What is self-limitation? That's intraspecific competition for limiting resources. So negative density dependence in real populations arises most often from intraspecific competition for resources broadly defined. Now then, so as opposed to, so we have these feedback processes. We've looked at negative density dependence, which we commonly encounter in ecology, but there's also positive density Now we get positive density dependence when the per capita growth rate is an increasing function of density. Now, this most commonly arises, and we are more familiar with the idea of alley effects. Has everybody heard of that? Yeah. So these appear in single species populations, in mutualistic interactions, so you get alley effects. But I want to talk about a somewhat less well-known source of positive density dependence, which arises from what are called saturating functional responses, okay? Which is a function or a response that organisms use in resource acquisition. So this is what I want to, because I think you know all this. So I'm assuming you know that, okay? If you don't, you can look it up. Right. Now, what's interesting about saturating functional responses, which I will define in a second, they generate positive feedback, which also in turn generates consumer resource oscillations in the absence of any environmental variation. Remember, we are talking about just nonlinear dynamics, right? So, is a functional response. A functional response is the per capita consumption rate, the number of prey consumed by a single predator per unit time, right? Everybody knows that, right? You didn't? Okay, now you do. All right. So, but we'll formalize this too. Okay. So here's what's called a saturating functional response. Why does this matter? Because most organisms in nature tend to exhibit a saturating functional response. What does that mean? That means the per capita consumption rate approaches a constant value as the resource density increases, right? So here's a function. Here, remember our function? So here's the function. Oh, this is the functional response, creatively named F. And here is what the equation, the form, the function we used to represent it. So biologically speaking, can someone tell me why the functional response saturates at high resource densities in a biological sense? Yes, Krishna.
Consumer gets full.
Exactly. I mean, you eat a lot like at festivals. Well, I actually do this at lunch and dinner. There's so much good food, but your stomach is full. Now, there's also parasites, parasitoid, insect parasitoids. How many people know what an insect parasitoid is? Or you need to know what an insect parasitoid is by the time you come to my tutorial. Okay, so they actually have an egg limitation because they lay their eggs in other organisms. If your egg complement is over, it doesn't matter how many hosts there are, right? Did the mic go off? Oh, okay, fine. All right, so that's this. I'm going through this very slowly.
So I can ask a silly question.
Yeah.
So you said that most organisms exhibit a saturating functional response. Is this something that we believe, or is this something?
No, it's real. I myself measured it. I've looked at thousands of them. Okay. So no, that's real because it's a biological reality. There's a constraint of gut limitation. That's like there's a constraint. You can't eat anymore, or you don't have enough eggs in time to make use of the resource that's presently available.
Is it easy enough and non-digressive enough that you can give us a little window into how you go about measuring these things?
Yeah, I can tell you that perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. I mean, we've done that. Labor intensive, but can be done. Okay. Okay. So now, what is this function consists of two important parameters. That's what's called the attack rate. That's the per capita consumption rate, meaning it's also per predator, right? The functional response is per capita consumption rate per resource. This is an H is the handling time. So what is the attack rate? This is your search rate. You go looking for food, right? Looking for a thing. What's your handling time? You capture it. Now you have to do something to get it into your mouth and eat. So an otter that captures some sort of shelled, like a bivalve, has to pound it against the rocks to get the flesh. That's a handling time. Eventually, it doesn't matter there are 1,000 mussels. You have to keep pounding it, and you sort of basically that takes you for it. Every individual has a certain amount of time, percentage of its lifespan that can be devoted to allocated to foraging, and that time is taken away more if you have a longer handling time. Okay, so this is a biological reality, and a lot of important things stem from this basic constraint. Right, so what happens is the handling time is what causes that's why. Because you have a handling time and you have a finite amount of time to forage, it doesn't matter, you run out of time, or because either you're full or because you don't have enough eggs because you spend too much time, right, for each. So now a very important thing about this is that the resource is then underexploited when it's abundant, right? The consumer cannot really depress the resource when it's at high density because it's already full, right? See, it's only here. So this can then, I claim and I'll show, generates positive feedback in the resource species per capita growth rate, right? That's just the functional response. Now, so to do this, we are going to look at this MacArthur-Rosenzweig pairwise consumer resource model. You have seen now, I think Akshit covered it, you've seen this. Almost everybody has seen this. The only difference is I don't use the carrying capacity, I use the per capita competition coefficient because that's what we measure in nature. That's 1 over carrying capacity. So the two important things to keep in mind are Q is self-limitation in the resource, and the saturating functional response is defined by the magnitude of H. The longer the handling time, the more quickly, yeah, good. So here's the point, the consumer's handling time generates positive feedback in the resource species per capita growth rate. So this is the resource species per capita growth rate. What's that value, which is plotted here when H is 0? Is R minus AC, right? But what happens when H is non-negative, H is non-zero? Now you keep subtracting something smaller from R, right? So what do you get? Positive feedback in the resource species per capita growth rate. Do you see that? The per capita growth rate is an increasing function of the species density. So if you understand negative positive feedback is the counterpoint to that. So the logistic model, you have the per capita growth rate decreasing with increasing density. Here, the resource species per capita growth rate increases with increasing density. And that is because the consumer's handling time actually causes the saturation, which introduces a positive density dependent effect. To make this very simple, I've assumed that the resource has density independent population growth here, right? There's no logistic growth. So in that case, this is all there is, right? So here, so what's the per capita growth rate? We divide this thing by R, right? If there's no density dependence, this comes to that, right? And then we can see that that's positive density dependence. Per capita growth rate increases with the species density. That's formally the definition. Okay. Now let's look. This is interesting and this is important. Now we look at the full model where the per capita growth rate has the negative density dependence due to self-limitation, positive density dependence due to the saturating functional response. Now the per capita growth rate is a nonlinear function of density, but it's a unimodal one, right? You see the qualitative difference that it changes from here to here. Here's the thing. Below a critical resource density, consumer control of the resource population is stronger than its self-limitation. Why? Would there be a lot of competition for resources in the resource species when its density is low? If there are very few of you and your nutrients are fully abundant, would you be competing? So, but you're being attacked by a consumer, right? So, which of the two effects are you going to be more limited by? The consumer or your own resource? When resource density is low? Consumer control, right? And we know that when there's consumer control and density dependent, negative feedback is weak, what do we get? positive density dependence. But as resource abundance increases, the resource species becomes limited by its own resources. If it's a, if it's a plant, if it's an insect herbivore, it's going to be limited by its host plant because there are more of you. So after this critical density, which you can derive, the per capita growth rate starts to decrease with density because self-limitation, negative feedback tends to override the positive feedback. So when you get sustained consumer resource oscillations, it's because of this tension between the consumer's handling time, which generates positive density dependence, and the resource species self-limitation, which generates negative density dependence, right? Is everybody happy with that? It's absolutely crucial. And also I wanted to say this. These are I never took a class in ecology. I learned everything from books. And so these are the lectures I wish I had when I was a student. And it may not seem important, or even that you may not grasp all of it. I never did when I was at your stage. But over the years, some of this will matter. You might remember, oh, that person came and said something, right? So I try to structure these in a way that you might want to come back to and look at it at some point. And today I'm also going to do a lot of this material that I'm going to build up very quickly on in my second and third lectures, okay? So it would be nice if you could look at your lectures, come prepared with things you don't understand, which we could address during the tutorial. The other thing is my lectures are determined by the content rather than time. So I might actually, this one might go a little bit into my second lecture, which is actually shorter. Okay, just telling you. So, okay. All right. So here we are. Now, so we see non-linearities can arise from density-dependent feedback processes. They can be negative density dependence, which is self-limitation, or positive density dependence, in this instance, arising from a saturating functional response. Actually, do they get access to these lectures? So I have also... If you want to share them with us, then we can... I would like to, so first of all, there's a lot of redundancy you will see, and that's on purpose, because then if you came back to it and 6 months later, what did she say? There are summaries and lots of redundancy, so you could follow. I'm happy to give you the lectures, okay? All right, so... Right. So here's a summary. As I said, non-linearities arise from feedback processes. These feedback processes arise from what? Interactions within or between species. What's negative feedback? It's a process, it's an outcome of intraspecific resources, right? And a positive feedback here is the result of consumers, the actual biological constraint of a consumer being limited by its gut capacity or its egg supply, so that they have a saturating response. Okay, right. Now, most organisms are limited by either their resources or their natural enemies. And often, not always, resources tend to generate self-limitation, and consumers, as we've seen in this particular case, can generate positive feedbacks, okay? And this one, I really want you to know, because it's really kind of not acknowledged or not even realized. Everybody has looked at the MacArthur-Rosenzweig model since kindergarten, but it's not always that people appreciate that there is a positive feedback in there that actually generates these oscillations. Right. So now we want to understand how these feedback processes, negative or positive, influences diversity, right? That's our large goal, maybe a lifetime sort of goal. And this, I want to point out, is diversity is an outcome, right? You go and count the number of species. That's an outcome. The process that generates that outcome is what we call coexistence. And that implies a lot of mechanisms that allow that diversity to be manifested, okay? Just to be clear, because people use these interchangeably, but they actually mean different things, especially if you're actually measuring things. Right. So now, since these nonlinearities arise from species interactions, I want to go through some representative, in fact, the interactions that form the building blocks of all natural communities. So we have exploitative and apparent competition, which are mutually negative interactions. We have mutualisms, which are mutually beneficial or facilitative mutually, positive interactions. And you have consumer resource interactions. These can be predator, prey, host, parasite, plant, herbivore, which are antagonistic, right? One species benefits, the other species is harmed. And that's really an important thing to keep in mind. This interaction embodies an inherent conflict of interest. It's to the advantage of the prey to run away, is to the advantage of the predator to run towards this. So they're always, who has heard of the life dinner principle? You should look it up. It's, the predator's running for its dinner, the prey is running for its life, right? All right, okay. So we're gonna go through it and try to understand. Yes, you have a question. I'm gonna go through it in a sec. So I think you've seen exploitative competition. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because this has been covered. If there's anything unclear, just stop me, okay? So I want to just make clear what this means. So these are indirect interactions between individuals of the same or different species as the result of acquiring a resource that's in limiting supply. Each individual negatively affects others solely by reducing the abundance of shared resources. They never need have a direct interaction. So you know the whole idea about the early bird gets the worm? That's exactly it. You get up early, you go get the worm. What does that mean? All the rate rices have fewer worms to get. Do you ever encounter each other? Perhaps not. That's what exploitative competition is about. Now, interference competition is you lie in wait, you beat the other guy up and get the worm, right? There is a direct interaction and often a cost, right? So here, thematic you are all familiar with. And here is a very simple model I'm sure you've seen now many times. The thing I want to point out is we have linear functional responses, okay? Not saturating, linear, right? So this again, I think you know, criteria for coexistence in a formal sense requires two things. There needs to be mutual invasibility, which means that each species must be able to increase from initially small numbers when its competitor or its, let's say, this is exploitative competition. So competitor is at equilibrium with the resource. And that's an absolutely necessary condition, right? If that can't happen, you do not have coexistence. That's when you get competitive dominance, which is also quite common in nature. Stability, in a mathematical sense here, is that this coexistence equilibrium is stable to perturbations of the species abundances, okay? And that is the sufficient conditions. Once you can invade, right, there's an internal, you know the difference between internal and boundary equilibria. We're going to refer to those quite a bit. So if this is, I'm going to do a two species, N2 and N1. What happens when N2 is absent and they have logistic growth, let's say two species? Well, look at the equation. Okay. There. So when N2 is not there, where would N1 be? That's a boundary equilibrium, right? That's N1, 0, right? That's a boundary equilibrium. When it's possible for N2 to actually increase from very small numbers, what do we get? And then the reverse is also true. Then you have the prospect of an internal equilibrium, right? In the state space, positive abundances of both species, right? And that's an interior equilibrium. This is a boundary equilibrium. Just to be sure that we are all on the same page, okay? So any questions about that?
Yes, we have a question.
Yeah, so necessary is its feasibility. So in other words, so feasibility is, can this internal equilibrium exist? How can it exist? What is the only way in which this can exist? Somebody? I could always run and get your names from and then call out randomly. Someone wants to take a stab at this. Krishna.
When the other one can.
Exactly. So if that's a necessary condition, right? Meaning without it, you can't, but it's not enough. Once you're here, where's my pen? Once you're here, here's stability. If you're perturbed, so like, you know, you're here N1 star, N2 star, right? Something happens, lightning strikes, fires come through. Now you're somewhere else. Can you come back? That's stability, and that's the sufficient. It's not enough to have a feasible interior. That's kind of the mathy jargon. Interior equilibrium, it has to be stable to perturbations of species abundances. Now that, in fact, is not the time to say this, but it's a very real thing. It's not, this is mathematical stability, but it has a very strong biological meaning, right? Anytime you have a primary forest, everybody know what a primary forest is. What is it? Logged or subject to disturbance, right? What happens when you log a primary forest? What have you done to the stability, the steady state of the primary forest? You have perturbed it. Does it come back? Have you ever heard of we usually call them secondary forest for a good reason. That's a kind of a sobering message. Where do you know whether the primary forest has actually gone back to a primary forest? Because once you perturb, different kinds of species come into that, but clearing, right? So this is pretty important biologically, and you can measure. What happens when you go do a field experiment? You dig stuff up, you plant new things. What have you done? You perturb the system. In 2 years, you get your results, you publish a paper testing equilibrium predictions. What have you done? You've just looked at the transient dynamics and you said, this system doesn't mean equilibrium prediction. Of course it doesn't. It's in the transient phase. You perturbed it, right? There you go. So this is why this matters. So it's not just mathematics, right? They mean something if you stare at it long enough. And if you take one thing away from my lectures, it's the patience to stare at some of these expressions and see what they mean. All right.
Priyanga, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was just thinking about this mutual invasibility as a necessary condition that you were talking about. I mean, so like usually in these scenarios that you're describing, it makes a lot of sense. But if you try to then think about it in the context of these alley effects that you were talking about,
So
then
that's a very good point.
It seems not
it is, except that it has to cross a certain threshold.
Exactly.
Right.
So then rare becomes somewhat.
So I am. Here, I'm not in the realm of the alley effects. If you have alley effects, I'm going to make something up here, right? There's some sort of a thing, and you have to exceed. That's not very well drawn. When we can maybe, but the point is, when you have an alley effect, species per capita growth rates decrease with decreasing density, positive density dependence, right? So in that case, there's a threshold density above which you can go to that interior equilibrium. We'll deal with this when I do mutualisms, okay? Right, now then, I ought to erase that. That looks really bad. There's a reason why I didn't go to art school. Okay, now then, okay. So this you have, I think, gone through. Mutual, so you compute these invasion criteria, and there's the usual jargon, consumer I, which could be 1 or 2 because we have a 2-species system, can invade when rare if you can maintain a positive per capita growth rate When it's rare and its competitor is at equilibrium with the resource, this, right? Positive per capita growth rate is you're starting from 0, but you can, or like small numbers, not 0, non-zero, small numbers, and you can go up. That's a positive per capita growth rate, right? Actually, if I erase this stupid thing, this figure could be useful. Right. So then, all right, let's keep it. And I should really learn to draw an array effect better, but next slide. Okay. Right. So we're going to compute these invasion criteria, and we're going to do something. We're going to do something called R star. You heard of R star? Indeed? Yeah. So is the resource level required for the consumer species to just maintain itself, balance consumption and mortality, right? You maintain yourself, meaning nothing's changing, but there's not an excess of deaths. Now, one thing I also want to say, except in perhaps one instant, I'm always looking, I'm teaching you models in which the resource abundance, resource dynamics are explicitly modeled. So this is not Lotka-Volterra, where you have an implicit sort of a constancy in the resource dynamics by saying there's a carrying capacity, right? I'm looking at models where we are actually looking at the resource dynamics. And this leads to a richer array of possibilities for coexistence or lack thereof, okay? So I just want you to note that all these models, there's logistic growth in that basal species, but we are modeling the dynamics of the resource explicitly. There isn't a carrying capacity of the resource in the sense that you've seen in the models, Lotka-Volterra models with alphas and Ks. Just want you to note that, okay? Right, and we find that coexistence is harder in this kind of system because of, so again, we're gonna go back to our system. Yeah. That's intra-specific competition, the logistic, right? But what I'm saying is when you look at a two-species Lotka-Volterra model, what you have a K1 and a K2, what is that telling you? That is the point at which that species reaches its maximum abundance given its ambient resource level. So you abstract out all of the dynamics of the resource of that species. So if you compete, you don't compete in the abstract, you compete for seeds, space, mates. So this is a way to ask, what are the seed dynamics? What are the nutrient dynamics? Okay, so it's a different way to look at the same problem. And it is through this you get these oscillations and some of the more richer array of dynamics. As I said, like you wouldn't have positive feedback unless you actually in some way add it. So we want mechanisms to emerge from our biologically informed formulation. So I'm always interested in, because, nutrients change, host plants grow. So there are dynamics. I'm always interested in the dynamics of the resource itself. Okay, and it also provides you another way to look at things, which is like you're broadening your sort of theoretical universe to look at this. So again, consumer J, which is like the resident species, let's say, is at equilibrium and its per capita growth rate is 0. We all know that. And there's some repetition, R star. And so when the resident consumer is at equilibrium with the resource, when the resource abundance is this. Now I want you to take a good hard look at this. We know that's the R star. This is the consumer's mortality rate. This is the consumer's birth rate. Search rate times the conversion efficiency. What is the conversion efficiency? So we could also say simply how many offspring of the consumer results from a unit of resource consumed, and does it have units? Yeah, so it's no unit, it's a scale, it's constant, right? It's more than one, you get more offspring than per unit of resource. Or if it's less than one, like with most predators, you get less, right? For any unit of resource consumed, you get half an offspring or less than one. So that is the birth rate, because when you attack something and you consume something, is that all going to be a one-to-one correspondence of your own acquisition of energy? No, it could be less, right? So it's scaled by this. So that is the birth rate of a consumer. Now, I want you to think about this and come back at the tutorial with answers. What is 1 over R star? And what does it mean biologically? Now, there's a group of you to whom I've diverged the answer. So you're either going to tell everybody else and everybody knows the answer, or you're going to take yourselves out of the game. These are the people to whom I spoke about this the other night. Yeah, so you're going to keep quiet. That would, if you don't keep quiet, nobody has any excitement about this, right? So anyway, but you can't put your hand up at the tutorial. Anyway, so think about, this is what I mean. We say there's an R star. There's some resource density. In some ways, like, who cares? It comes out of the thing, which actually means something very important. Okay, invert it. Think about what that is. Right, now, okay. So here is a summary of all that, what I said. And now we can write down the invading species consumer I's invasion criterion. That's its per capita, that is its per capita growth. R star Cj, what is R star Cj? It's the equilibrium abundance of its competitor, consumer J, right? Which is given by that. And you've seen all this. We substitute. So we see, obviously, consumer species I can invade a community consisting of the resource and consumer J. What? When its per capita growth rate is positive. Right. So here are the mutual invasibility criteria. That's the invading, let's say consumer 2. No, sorry, consumer 1's per capita growth rate. That's consumer 2's R star. You've seen this before, right? You're happy with this. We rewrite this way. Have you seen that before? That's just, yeah. What do we find? These things are mutually exclusive, right? Both can't be true at the same time. Which means that if one increases when rare, the other cannot. What do you get? Competitive dominance by one species. So here's the famous R star rule. Consumer species that drives the resource abundance to the lowest level excludes all others. But as I said, 1 over R star means something very important. Right. So in a constant environment, I'm repeating things you know, R star rule operates and the superior competitor excludes the inferior competitors. What does it mean to be a superior competitor? It should have a higher attack rate and conversion efficiency, maybe one of them, and or a lower death rate. Either way, whatever the combination of traits it has, conversion efficiency, attack rate, mortality rate, they should be such that R star is lower than all the other species, right? So you have to think really hard. What does mortality mean? What is 1 over mortality? So there are things there. Right? So I want you to take a deeper look, this is what I said at the beginning, at what this R star thing really means to an organism. All right, so obvious conclusion, in a homogeneous environment, since we have no environmental variation, just the nonlinearities generated by species interactions, there's no coexistence. Right, now we want to look at apparent competition. Who asked me about that? Here, thank you for waiting. Here. So apparent competition is interesting. These are indirect interactions between individuals that share a common natural enemy. They do not compete for a common limiting resource, okay? Each individual negatively affects others solely by changing the abundances of the shared enemy. Funnily enough, this is quite common in nature. And this was first proposed, this idea in 1977, long before you were born, by Robert Holt, okay? He was a graduate student at Harvard. Right, okay. So here's the story. I'm going to use a really simple model here, okay? The simplest model we can come up with, because I want to illustrate some things. And here are the equations. I'm going to give you the lecture, so don't worry. Prey species 1, prey species 2, everybody has a linear response here, right? The prey has linear, what? Functional responses. And what's the thing in brackets? Can someone tell me what the thing in the brackets is? Per capita growth rate. Say that, all of you. Per capita growth rate. That's the reason why I took the abundances out. So you can see very simple expressions for fitness, right? Per capita growth rate. Yeah.
Why is it minus on the second and plus?
Oh, sorry. Wait, no. Yeah, that should be a plus. Sorry. Good catch. Yeah, that should be a plus because it's obviously getting both. Talk about typos. All right. Here, prey species I can invade when rare. Same story, right? If the other prey species is at equilibrium with the predator, meaning you have a pairwise predator-prey interaction, right? We are asking, can a second prey species invade the system, just like can a second competitor? Except that the biology here is completely different. Did you have a question? No, okay. Right. Here, prey species J is at equilibrium with the research. What is that? When the per capita growth rate is 0. Here, something new. Predator abundance at which the prey species J's per capita growth rate is 0 is termed the prey species P star value. Really creative, right? The predator abundance but this actually has a lot of important biology underneath this, at which the prey species J's reproduction is balanced by mortality, right? P star, right? Now then, so we go through the whole thing. Here's P star. Now you have to really pay attention to what this means. This is the prey species growth rate. What is this? The predator's attack rate on the prey. There are two opposing entities, right? This is what increases the prey species fitness. This, remember the conflict of interest, like, you know, because this is actually, you have a predator-prey interaction in each pairwise link, right? But you have something akin to competition coming out of the collective, right? Okay. So, yes, Krishna.
Time average, sorry, because I'd imagine just we could have predator-prey oscillation.
We are not getting there till, because you can't get that with a linear functional response. Never. Okay, good point though. We will do that. So, summary, there's the P star. And then we can write down the invading prey species per capita growth rate, which is this, right? So if that's positive, now you see nothing to do with the resource, like the growth rate of that species is all to do with the additional mortality due to predation, right? So this is what's really driving this system. And of course, as long as this is positive, we don't know when and how yet. And then we can do the same thing as before, right? This is very simple. We do this and we rewrite these, and we find, what do we find? Can both of those two be true at the same time? They can't. So again, we find that the innovation criteria are mutually exclusive in this very simple model with linear functional responses. That's a good reason. We'll get to that. So we get the P star rule. What fun? Prey species that's the least susceptible to the predator will exclude others. What does that mean here? So in competition, it has to be the lowest star. What about P star? Now I want you to think about that. What does it mean to be least susceptible? You can withstand higher predator abundance at which your other apparent competitor is dust, right? So that's the thing. By driving predator, do you see there's a whole lot of wealth of biology buried in this simple model, right? If you drive the predator's abundance, it's going to then start attacking the other species as well because there's more predators, right? So indirectly, without ever having competed or done anything else with that species, never having had any encounters with the other prey species, you can still cause its exclusion, right? Potentially, in the absence of other mediating factors, all of which we have eliminated for the time being, right? There's no variation in this system. It's important to understand what the baseline is, which is what we are going through in this lecture. Okay. So in a constant environment, we get the P-star rule, and the prey species that's least susceptible to the predator exclude all others. What is it? What does it mean to be less susceptible? It could have a higher intrinsic growth rate, right? Or it could be harder for the predator to catch. It's got horns or something, who knows? But, right. So now, why is it that the prey species that's less susceptible to, I think some of you got this. I kind of got ahead about myself. I want you to think of that and come back for the tutorial. This is a question for you. Why does a species, I think we answered this actually, but by tomorrow, if you've forgotten, we'll check. Right. And competition in a homogeneous environment leads to competitive exclusion, equivalent to apparent competitive exclusion and loss of diversity, just like exploitative competition in a homogeneous environment. Now, here's the question. Why is coexistence not possible with pure exploitative and pure exploitative and apparent competition? Here's the key. What did we learn in my initial sort of covering of this thing? Stable coexistence requires negative feedback mechanism, right? Species should limit themselves. This is axiomatic. Species should limit themselves more than they limit others, right? That's the only thing you kind of have to know. And for that to happen, what is the definition of negative feedback in our universe? Per capita growth rates have to be decreasing functions of, do you see anything like that in these systems? Do you? No. Are you all happy that we don't see a negative feedback? Neither the competitor nor the apparent competitor's growth rate is a function of its own density, right? It's a function of the predators or the competitor's density. That doesn't work because negative density depletion, by definition, is your per capita growth rate has to decline, and that's when you can increase when rare and decrease when you're abundant, right? You have population regulation, and if you don't have population regulation, you don't get coexistence because species are not persisting on their own either, right? Exclusion due to insufficient non-linearity in species interactions because of the very simple models we formulated, right? To allow for mutual invisibility, okay? Right, it's because we start with very, very simple models. That's where we always start, and then we ask, well, that didn't work, right? And we know species coexist in nature, and this is really the challenge. How do they coexist? Can we get at least a glimmering of an understanding of that? So, here's another question. Can there be sufficient non-linearity in species interactions to enable coexistence in still constant environments, meaning the external environment, be it biotic or abiotic, is not changing, okay? You understand, right? We are proceeding in the under the exact same constraints, but we are asking if can in some way there be sufficient non-linearity in the absence of variation to allow species to coexist, okay? Right. So there are two mechanisms. One is the idea of trade-offs. What are trade-offs? They arise from constraints. All organisms have a finite amount of energy to expend within their lifespan. That means if you spend a lot of energy on reproduction, you don't live as long, That's a trade-off. Is that what the organism could conceivably maximize its fitness? It could have a lot of reproduction and could live long, but it also has a limited amount of energy. That's the fact of life, right? So you have a constraint. The constraint is, well, the energetic constraint then leads to life history trade-offs, okay? What is a life history trade-off? High reproduction, higher mortality, or yeah, right. So, yeah, non-linear. So basically when you, otherwise your population growth line, what is a line? mx plus y equals mx plus c, that's a line, right? That's linear, right? Line, yeah. So what's the difference? If you know what happens now, we can predict to any time in the future because it has a constant slope. But if it's non-linear, means it's no longer a line, right? So we see functional responses are not lines, per capita growth rates are not lines, that's non-linearity. But that happens due to something really biologically important, which is intraspecific competition, or the fact that your predators have a limited gut capacity and can't really regulate your population. Well, I just spoke anthropomorphically, but you know what I mean. Okay, so here's the idea. So let's say we have two species in this system. One is a superior competitor for their common limiting resource. Okay, let's say this is a plant, two plant species. They compete for limiting nutrients, happens every day out there. But they are also attacked by a herbivore, right? That's the question, something like that. I would also like all of you to come up with biological examples of that so we can see, okay? Some example like that, trees, I don't care, you know, barnacles, whatever. So how is this possible? So here's an idea, some conjecture. If one is a superior competitor for the common resource, but is also susceptible to a common predator, what is that? It's good at acquiring resources, but because it has limited amounts of energy, it can't invest in predator defense mechanisms. Got it, right? That's the reality. So that's possible. So we are making this, we are constructing this hypothesis verbally. We say that's possible. Now it's up to us to develop a model that includes their biology and find out whether this can happen. Okay, that's what I meant, right? First principle. So we come up with a model based on what you know about competition and predation, which we went through, right? Now we build a model with competition and predation. You see? And ask what's the outcome. So you have different sorts of nonlinearities now than, more nonlinearities than we had before, right? Okay. And the second mechanism, and I think this is what Krishna was getting at, this is called relative nonlinearity. Species have different nonlinear responses to a resource or a natural enemy. So your functional response could have different degrees of nonlinearities if the consumers differ in what? Their handling time, right? Their handling time. So this is it's not difficult, but when you're starting out, this mechanism means nothing. It takes a while to absorb this, but it's actually a very simple idea, okay? So you differ in the nonlinearities, right? You differ in your nonlinearities, and under certain circumstances, that can lead to coexistence, and we are going to look at both of these, right? So in both cases, negative feedback, negative density dependence, such that species limit themselves more than they do others, meaning what? Stronger intra-specific competition than interspecific competition, can lead to what's called local niche partitioning in the absence of environmental variation, okay? These constraints imposed by these energetic constraints, ultimately imposed by the fact that an organism can have only a finite amount of energy, can create differences between species, right? That can then allow for coexistence under certain circumstances. What we are going to find out is, can that happen? So let's look at this one, coexistence via trade-offs that lead to resource partitioning. Did I say so? Oh, there's something I need to say, but I hopefully have put myself an indicator. So I'm going to introduce you to an interaction called intra-gill predation. So we have two consumers that compete for a limiting resource. What's that? Exploitative competition, right? What's different here is that one consumer can prey or parasitize the other. So the two competitors also engage in what's called a trophic interaction. What is trophic? To eat, right? So you have an antagonist. So your competition is what? A mutually negative interaction. What is predation or parasitism? An antagonistic interaction with a conflict of interest, right? So that's now combined with competition, and we're going to have something different from what we saw before. And this is very common in nature. I study an insect system in which this happens, okay? This is a very common mechanism. And species that compete for a limiting resource also engage in some kind of trophic interaction, right? Here is again a very simple model. Look, there are no saturating function responses. There are no added non-linearities. You have the exploitative competition model, but here there's an additional mortality term on consumer 1 due to predation by consumer 2, right? You see? Because we didn't have this in the exploitative competition model, right? So there's a functional response there. And then that translates into a net benefit for consumer 2. So we say consumer 1 is the intra-guild prey. We call them within a guild because why? They compete for the same thing. So they're in a guild, competitive guild. Within that guild, you now get predation. So, and this one is the intra-guild predator. So remember we have consumer 1 is the intra-guild prey, the one that gets eaten, and consumer 2 is the intra-guild predator. So just remember the notation, okay? Well, I'll remind you. Now we're going to do something that I like to do. It's called non-dimensionalization. And the advantage of that, it reduces the number of parameters, which itself is not so great, but it can also, if you do this right, it can highlight the scaling, natural scaling relationships between different biological parameters. Yes. Wait. Sorry. F is the, oh yeah, I forgot. That's the conversion efficiency of the predation on the other species, which is distinct from the conversion efficiency for the resource. Sorry, I forgot to explain that. So that's the additional term, okay? Right. So now you can do this in an umpteen number of ways. You can divide things by the other things and you can get something. No, we do it with some biological insight. We look at it, we can ask, what are the natural scaling relationships we understand in this community, okay? This is not a haphazard exercise, yeah.
Scaling relationship.
Yeah, I'm going to show it to you, okay? You will see what that is meant. So here's the thing. So resource abundance is given by R, right? That's what, 50, 100, right? Okay, first of all, equations have units, right? This equation has units. What is this side? Numbers per time. That means this side, all of these expressions have to have numbers per time. And depending on, then we have sort of interesting units. That's 1 over time. This is not 1 over time. This is 1 over time times numbers, because this has to balance out. E1 has no units, right? Attack rate is an interesting parameter. So what do you mean by non-dimensionalization? You get rid of the units, but you have to do it in a way that each metric, each scaling relationship has no units. If you were doing this thing, you would check for your units, first of all, right? If you're measuring these things, have I got this correct? So we are now doing this with some awareness of the biology. So we're going to say for the resource species, I'm going to scale the resource abundance by the resource species carrying capacity, which is the maximum abundance it can possibly have. Now, if I said the resource abundance is 50, that doesn't mean anything. Like, so what? But if I said resource abundance is close to 1, what does that mean? Because if resource abundance is this, that means it's quite close to carrying capacity. The population is being regulated, right? What does that mean? How does population regulation arise? Yeah, but what's the process? This is what I want you to understand, right? So you see, we have a lot of words for these things. Yes, population regulation occurs when there's negative density dependence in the per capita growth rate. That creates a negative feedback. So you see, that's the level depth at which you have to think about these things. Okay, right? Eventually, not tomorrow, not even within this week, but throughout your careers, right? So that actually is useful, right? If it's 0.1, it's very far from carrying capacity, right? But then we have to also do it for the consumer. Now, for the consumer, it's not K because it has to be scaled by the conversion efficiency. It could be larger than K, right? If you're a parasite, could be lower. So that's, so everybody understands this, right? So we now got rid of the units for the abundances. Now, scaling time is the most important thing. And that you want to do with some awareness, with some biological insight. In these models, if you didn't have a resource, what would happen? Would this exist? No. Without a resource, does this community exist? So we would think the resource species growth rate, for example, would be a natural way to scale time, right? Because after all, the resource species growth rate 1 over time is the thing that is most important because there are no consumers without resource, right? So we decide that we're going to scale time in terms of the resource species growth rate. That's time. This is 1 over time. We have something called tau. That's a non-dimensional metric of time. And then we keep doing that. And this is really good. Look, we scale the consumer's growth rates in terms of this is what is scaling, right? You got rid of the units. But that's really important. If that's greater than 1, what is that telling you? The consumer's death rate is really high, right? Meaning it lives a very short time relative to the resource turnover. That's important, right? So you see how these things actually mean something, right? So it's not a matter of balancing units. It's a matter of doing it in a way. So as a kind of a rule of thumb, scaling things by the resource species vital rates is usually a good way to identify these natural scaling relationships. And then I told you the attack rate is a kind of an odd thing because it's got numbers and time. So you need to not just divide by R, you have to actually scale it by consumers, new non-dimensional abundance. Now, don't worry, Prajwal is going to go through some of this. It's actually fun. Sit down and see whether you can actually do this, starting with the logistic, which I think Prajwal is going to do in tutorial. And then we'll kind of, my advisor taught me this when I was a graduate student. And I sat there and I got a feel for it eventually, okay? And alpha's the same. So we have the abundance term, we have the time term, and we get a non-dimensionalized attack rate of each species on the resource and the integrative predator's attack rate on the integrative prey. Remember the alpha, right? So we have put an alpha hat. Then here's an important thing. These conversion efficiencies do not have units, but it's good to kind of lump them into what we call an efficiency metric. And on top, bottom is the IG praise conversion efficiency of the resource to its own offspring. This is a product of the IG predator's conversion of resource into offspring times is conversion of IG prey into offspring, right? So it's a kind of a useful metric, and we call it F star. And so here are non-dimensionalized quantities. They're not just parameters, right? We also have the state variables. And then we do this extremely annoying thing, which is that we drop the hats. And we pretend that these things are the same as the original things, but so much is imagining having to remember to write the hats all the time. Try that a few times, even in like LaTeX. But anyway, so now we have a really nice simple system. R has gone away. A lot of stuff has disappeared, but more importantly, we have these quantities that mean something in terms of the relative rates at which things occur, right? So, and we're going to do our favorite things, which is to derive the mutual invisibility criteria and the stability. I'm not going to even, right. So what we do is we do the mutual invisibility analysis, which you can now do in your sleep. But we can also do the local stability analysis for this 3-species system because it's kind of interesting. It's just like some tools that are useful, okay? Here. So because this is a 3x3, this is a 3-species system, you can't just write the per capita growth rate and get the invasion criteria, right? So what we do is we calculate the Jacobian matrix. Everybody knows what the Jacobian matrix is. We evaluate it at the boundary equilibrium for the species that's resident, Ig prey or Ig predator. Then we look at the dominant eigenvalue of that Jacobian, which happens to be suspense. Oh, we had to wait a bit. Okay, sorry. Here's the Jacobian for this 3x3 system. Okay, and this means that this is evaluated at equilibrium. You know all this, right? You are experts on this. Now, oh, I wish I hadn't put that. Okay, shoot. Okay, now, these negative terms, so the diagonal represents self-limitation, right? That would be the negative feedback. Right? The diagonal, have you ever paid attention to Jacobian that the diagonal is all self-limitation terms, right? Now, of the diagonal, on top are the consumer's effect, meaning like all the consumer effects on the resource, or in this case, the Ig predator's effect on the Ig prey, right? What is in the bottom of the diagonal at the bottom are the beneficial effects. So the resource has beneficial effects on both Ig prey and Ig predator, and inconceivably for the Ig prey, it also has a benefit on the Ig predator, right? Now, can you notice something about this matrix? Hint, look at the off diagonals. How much time do I have?
Chapter 1.
What is it now? Yeah. I can't read time. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's in military time. No, never mind. Okay.
That's how much time is left.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. I have 18 minutes and 13 seconds ticking by. Here's what it is. Notice that the signs, look at the signs of the off-diagonal elements. It's all negative on top and positive on the bottom. It's called a quasi-symmetric matrix. And in this particular case, all eigenvalues are real. What does that mean? Are there going to be intrinsic oscillations? Are there going to be intrinsic oscillations if all eigenvalues are real? No. Isn't that a useful thing to find out? Isn't that a useful thing to find out? I thought it was amazing when so those of you who are in physics and mathematics, who knows the spectral theorem, here's a community exercise. You're going to teach the biologists how you prove that. How's that? Meet after class, meet after dinner. Will you undertake to do that for me? No? You're not good sports. You don't want to teach your fellow students. Yes, of course you're going to do that. Okay, right. So I don't have time. There. Now we are going to do this at the appropriate boundary equilibrium. The only difference is this is a 3x3. And here are the boundary equilibria, right? Remember, boundary means only two are present now, right? Because it's a 3-species system, resource and Ig prey, resource and Ig predator. And Here's the innovation criteria. We're going to do it for IG Predator first. We evaluate the Jacobian at the boundary equilibrium with the resource and consumer one, which is IG prey, which gives the entire environment, the biotic environment for the IG predator, hey, pay attention, to increase in small numbers. When it's in small numbers, right? Okay. Oops. Sorry. What did I say? Yeah. Then we compute the eigenvalues of the Jacobian, find the dominant eigenvalue. Now, here's the beauty of it. The dominant eigenvalue of the Jacobian is, when evaluated at the boundary equilibrium, is the per capita growth rate of the species that's trying to invade the system. And why do we have to do all this? Because it's a 3x3, right? Unlike in the pairwise, you can't just look at it and write out the thing. If that dominant eigenvalue is positive, which means the equilibrium with the resource and consumer one is unstable. We know that, right? A negative the dominant eigenvalue. That means consumer 2 has a positive per capita rate when it's rare and can invade a community of the resource, and consumer 1, which is the integrative prey. So this is really important. This is asking, can the integrative predator invade a pairwise interaction between the resource and the integrative prey? There you go. Right, so you do it for both species. Here are the boundary equilibria. Now we're going to substitute, right? For this, I'm just reminding you which is what it looks like. And that here, what am I doing? There, okay. There. Now we substituted. Now we get a lot of interesting things. Why is that 0? What's this? This is the IG prey's effect on itself. Why is that 0? There wasn't any density dependence. This looks like there is though, right? For the IG predator. It looks like there is. Do you think there's self-limitation in the IG predator in this system based on the equations? Well, we'll find out. So, in this case, the eigenvalues of the Jacobian are the roots of this characteristic equation, which is a cubic. And obviously, the dominant eigenvalue is the one with the largest absolute value. Here, I'm going to just give this to you because it's easy to calculate. The dominant eigenvalue of the Jacobian evaluated at the boundary equilibrium resource and IG prey is this. That is the per capita growth rate of the IG predator when it's rare. Remember, we have evaluated this thing at the boundary equilibrium with the resource and the IG prey, right? This is just like before, except we just have to do a little bit more complicated mathematics here. But we got it, and I'm going to let you work that out. So it can invade when rare. Notice two interesting things. I want you to pay attention. Don't have to say anything. There's a quantity in brackets here, and here's a quantity in brackets here. Hint, one of those things has to be positive for this system to make sense. Okay? Any biological sense. And then we do the same thing for the other species. We get this. I said that before. Here. Here are the two, both the innovation criteria, right? There's that, there's this, and there's this. Let me see what I have. Now I want you to look at this. What are these things? What does that give you? Just take that quantity and manipulate it. Is that positive or negative? Sorry. Would that help? If that's positive, can this be positive? Not like no light bulb going off in your head about that? Yeah, indeed. When did we see that before? R star. This is the R star in the non-dimensionalized model, isn't it? So see, this is what I meant about looking at these things. Because we said this is like a system where there is competition, R star, and predation, P star, right? So what can we say before we do anything else? What can we say? Both can't be true at the same time. What about this thing in the brackets? What about that thing in the brackets? I'm sorry, I'm going really quickly because I have a lot to cover. You're gonna like sit down with this stuff if you're interested, and you can go through and you'll see a lot of things, right? That you'll see a lot of things, interesting things. So what is that? For a consumer, what is A1 and D1? Well, what's D1? Yeah, in the non-dimensionalized model, what is this? The birth rate. Remember, E times A became A hat. So what does this have to be for this system to be? What do these things have to be for this system to make any sense? Do you see? Species have to persist before they coexist. We could have just gone through these things and said positive constants, you know, and done something, or we could have paused to ask biologically, what does either of these things mean? And now we know these have to be positive. It's easy, right? Because the criteria for stability and, you know, this is a little hard in this model. All right, so here's our thing. We said these trade-offs, right? Trade-offs might lead to partitioning of resources or natural enemies. So if one species is the superior competitor for the common resource, lower R star, but is more susceptible to a common predator, lower P star, we may, this was our conjecture, remember? We may get coexistence, right? So here we have integrative predation, which is a little bit more complicated than competition because you have two consumers that compete for a common resource. The resource has explicit dynamics, and they also engage in a trophic interaction. So we know that consumer 1 is susceptible to predation from consumer 2. That's a one-way trophic interaction. What does that mean? IG prey has this additional mortality term, right? So who's disadvantaged in this system? The IG prey. If there is to be coexistence, it has to be at the very least a superior competitor for the baser resource, right? Remember? So that's the idea. They can partition the resource and the natural enemy. Thus, can that happen is what we are trying to get to. So, of course, with the R star rule, how do we determine? The R star rule means the competitor that has the consumer that reduces the resource level to the lowest level. So here are the R stars, right? Remember, this is the non-dimensionalized model. So the E's have disappeared, right? And D is actually scaled by the resource growth rate. So they are all exactly scaled by the same thing. So here, if the IJ prey is the superior competitor for the resource, this inequality should be satisfied, meaning its R star has to be lower than the R star of the IG predator. And why do I have this? Because obviously, that has to be lower than the carrying capacity of the resource, or else the IG predator cannot coexist, right? So you see, but it's important to point, you know, that inequality has to stand entirely. So we get this. So that means that, and that gives you this, and we know these have to be true. Does this look familiar to you from a few slides back? Yeah. So we know that's got to be positive because that's the only way IG prey can have a lower R star, meaning that the only way the IG prey could be a superior competitor. And that's negative, right? That's negative. So we need to obviously look at the other terms of these criteria, right? You agree? Because on this part is competition. IG prey clearly has the advantage. Of course, it has a negative term there, right? Right? So this has to be stronger than that. That's predation. On the other hand, look at that is the they have different kinds of ways of solving the energetic constraint, right? This one is a superior competitor for the resource, but it's susceptible to this predator. This one doesn't get attacked by anything, but it's an inferior competitor. So that means this has to, it's the nutrition it derives from its competitor has to compensate for its inferiority in resource competition. Okay, right. So here, resource competition and integrative predation, and if they're both equal competitors, we know the integrative prey is going to be eliminated from the system because it gets preyed upon as well as competing. But yeah, so but then it is possible only if it's a superior competitor, but it has to be sufficiently superior to overcome the additional mortality due to being preyed upon by the IG predator. Otherwise, we would need equations, would we? Because we could say, oh, well, that balances out. But it has to be a certain amount or else it wouldn't work. And frequently it doesn't work. So here, so that we've done that. And now we're going to ask, what's the stability of this equilibrium? There's the coexistence equilibrium for this system. And here's the Jacobian. And here's the thing. So we have this, this equation, right? It has three coefficients, A1, A2, and A3. And you can look at, so we find out through some algebra, A1 is equal to the equilibrium resource abundance at the coexistence equilibrium, okay? A2 is this quantity. Can you say something about whether this is positive or negative? If all the equilibria are positive, which has to be if it's a coexistence is feasible, right? This one's a little tricky, right? This one's not immediately obvious. So we use for this system, instead of actually calculating the eigenvalues, which are rather involved, we can use what's called the Routh-Hurwitz criteria. Okay, it's nice for 3 by 3s, very good actually. So basically it says something about the coefficients. A1 has to be, that's the first coefficient in the cubic, has to be positive. A3 has to be positive, and this quantity has to be positive. So if those are satisfied, that means that you have negative, the equilibrium is stable because the dominant eigenvalue is negative, right? So it's the opposite now. This is not admissibility. This is, so, well, oh here. So we know A1 is positive. We already saw A2 is positive. So our big issue is A3, right? Look at A3 very carefully. Under what conditions would this inequality always be satisfied? Well, I have said it. If f is greater than 1, right? That means it gets, remember this f is like the non-dimensionalized. Like, so in the original model, if its gain, reproductive gain from preying on the IG prey is greater than the gain to the IG prey from resource competition, then this can be satisfied, right? And then this is easy, don't you think? Is there a problem with this one being positive? No, but this one's tricky, right? This one depends on f. If f is small, this may not be met. And that means we've identified something really important in this system, that the conversion efficiency of the IG predator determinants plays a large role in the stability of the equilibrium. They may invade when they are rare, right? but to stably persist in the long term, in a mathematical sense, to attract nearby initial conditions, that F plays a large role. Okay. Now, so we get this. That's the full set of stability, the Ruth-Hurwitz criteria, and we can see that they actually translate to this. Okay, which is that consumer 1, the IG prey is superior at resource competition. It has a higher attack rate and a lower mortality rate. Consumer 2 gets sufficient benefit from preying on consumer 1, which means it has a higher attack rate, alpha, right? Because that's its attack rate on the IG prey, and high conversion efficiency, which means that our conjecture is actually plausible, right? If the IG prey is a superior competitor for the common resource, since obviously the IG predator gains a benefit, depending on the relative magnitudes of those two, coexistence is possible. Now, it's necessary, right? It's only a necessary condition. And that's really important. It's important because these trade-offs actually have to lead to some sort of partitioning of resources and natural enemies, okay? Just because you have trade-offs doesn't guarantee coexistence. So let me come back to that. So basically, let me just summarize this, and then we'll talk about that before we end. So trade-offs leading to partitioning of resources and natural enemies, provided there's a resource partitioning. That means that one species is superior competitor, is more susceptible, so lower R star, but lower P star. And why does this happen? Because it generates that negative feedback that we didn't get in the previous models, right? Ultimately, that's why. And this is how does that negative feedback occur? It occurs through local niche partitioning. Think about it. The IG prey's only resource is the basal resource species. What about the IG predator? It has two resource partitioning. Anytime you have resource partitioning, what do? You limit yourself more than you limit your competitors because interspecific competition is now reduced. Right? Because if you have two resources and you're only competing for one of them, right? It's not as strong as in pure exploitative competition. Do you see that? That's all really that you need to sort of understand. The details will come together once you sit with these things, if you're interested in going through these things. But it's a really important thing. Now, here, this is what I want to leave you with. I think we are going to do relative nonlinearity in the next lecture. Do trade-offs always allow coexistence? Is the question. You've heard of fitness differences and stabilizing niche differences. You heard these things, right? You have heard of these things? So, fitness differences are when species exhibit just differences in their per capita growth rates. That alone cannot give you coexistence. It doesn't generate a mechanism by which species limit themselves more than they limit others. Those are called fitness differences. So fitness differences can maybe prolong the time to exclusion, but cannot guarantee coexistence. Stable and niche differences, meaning, basically what does that mean? You're using different things and thereby reducing interspecific competition, or you're somehow partitioning the resource in a way that reduces interspecific interactions, which are negative relative to intraspecific interactions. That's clear, right? So that's the idea. So that means just because all species have trade-offs, because there's an inherent limitation on energy. Do they always go to? No. And that's what you have to be careful about. So how many people have heard of a competition colonization trade-off? It doesn't always work because mostly what it does is to generate fitness differences. Okay, right. So I think I need to stop. So here, resource partitioning leads to stronger intraspecific interactions than interspecific interactions. And that's so obvious when you write it down. The question is, can it arise even in the model that you've developed to represent nature? Right? So that's the thing. And so I said that coexistence via non-linearity alone can arise via two mechanisms. And by some miracle, I've actually come to the point of covering the first one, which is trade-offs. With the caveat, trade-offs alone are not sufficient unless they generate sufficient negative feedback. And then the second one is selective non-linearity, which we will do in the next lecture. Tomorrow? No, Thursday. Okay, so we have a tutorial tomorrow. I would like you to try to answer the questions that I post during lecture, okay? And it will be good if you look at your notes before you come to the tutorial, which means we should actually try to give the lectures to them, right? I can send a PDF to someone. Okay, thank you.